The sun of late summer burned relentlessly over the Texas plains, pressing down on rows of men standing at attention within the fenced boundaries of a prisoner of war camp. Their uniforms, once crisp with German insignia, now hung loose, faded by months of labor and American weather. Dust clung to their boots as silence filled the yard. Then came the words, sharp but steady, from an American officer. "Say goodbye to America. Tomorrow you board the trains." The order rippled through the assembled prisoners like a shockwave. Some straightened their shoulders in mechanical obedience, but others faltered. A few covered their faces. One man, tall and gaunt, whispered to the ground, "Nein, we want to stay." Soon others echoed him, their voices cracking, carrying not defiance but sorrow. It was a moment that unsettled even the guards, men hardened by years of war. This is the untold story of how enemies discovered humanity in the most unlikely of places. And if you want to uncover more hidden stories of World War II, subscribe now and stay with us as we journey through the forgotten truths that textbooks rarely tell. Captain Robert Harris, just 30 years old, stood near the command post, his cap tilted against the sun. He was the officer in charge of Camp Bowie's German section, a responsibility he had accepted with discipline, but not without questions. He had grown up on a small farm in Missouri, raised on sermons of duty and country. Yet, as he observed these men, who no longer looked like fearsome enemies but weary sons, fathers, and brothers, his conscience whispered doubts he could not silence. He remembered the first day he had been posted here, when he had expected hostility, defiance, maybe even hatred. Instead, he saw confusion and guarded relief. Many prisoners captured in North Africa had marched under scorching desert heat before boarding ships to America. They expected cruelty at the hands of their captors. Instead, they were fed, clothed, and given medical care. Harris knew his orders: keep them secure, prevent escape, maintain discipline. But what no manual had explained was how to handle the quiet moments when these men showed themselves not as enemies, but as human beings. The camp stretched across acres of flat land, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. Inside, the prisoners lived in barracks built of wood, plain and functional. The heat of Texas summers pressed against the walls, and the winters bit through thin blankets. Yet compared to the hunger and devastation in Europe, this camp was a sanctuary. Here, men played soccer with balls made of rags, sang songs in the evenings, and sketched memories of home on scraps of paper. Harris had watched them, at first detached, then with reluctant interest. One of them, a schoolteacher from Hamburg named Wilhelm Krüger, stood out. His English was polished, his demeanor calm, his voice always measured. Unlike some who clung stubbornly to ideology, Wilhelm spoke of books, of music, and sometimes, though cautiously, of the tragedy of war. Harris found himself listening against his better judgment. But not all saw things the same way. Among the guards, some muttered that the prisoners had it too easy. Local townsfolk, burdened by rationing and loss, often resented the sight of enemy soldiers well fed behind fences. Rumors whispered that Harris was too soft on them. He tried to brush it aside, clinging to regulation and order, yet he could not deny the unsettling truth. These men were beginning to see America not as their captor, but as a place of dignity, perhaps even of hope. That realization stirred something deep within him. What did it mean if the enemy began to admire the very nation they had been taught to hate? What did it say about the ideals Harris himself had sworn to protect? Standing in the dusty yard, watching tears form in the eyes of men in German uniforms, Harris understood that this assignment would not be defined by barbed wire or military protocol. It would be defined by the fragile line between duty and humanity. The trains would arrive soon. The war in Europe was shifting, and Washington wanted its prisoners repatriated. Yet as Harris looked out across the camp, he knew this story was far from over. The question was not whether these men would leave, but what would happen to their hearts once they did. And so began a journey where enemy and guardian alike would confront not just the weight of war, but the meaning of freedom itself. The train screeched to a halt under the Texas sun, its metal body radiating heat like a furnace. Dust swirled across the platform as the doors opened and German prisoners stepped out, blinking against the blinding light. Some carried duffel bags marked with faded stencils, others nothing but the clothes on their backs. They looked worn, their faces drawn by hunger and endless weeks of travel across the ocean. Captain Robert Harris stood with a clipboard in hand, watching as the line formed. Guards guided the men into orderly ranks, rifles slung across their shoulders, though the air carried no tension of imminent violence. These were not the stormtroopers of propaganda posters. These were tired men stripped of war's illusions. "Name?" Harris asked the first prisoner, his tone firm. "Lieutenant Hans Becker," came the reply, voice hoarse yet steady. The man saluted out of habit, then lowered his arm awkwardly, realizing the gesture was wasted. The roll call continued, names written down in careful strokes of ink. Some prisoners stared straight ahead with stiff discipline, while others glanced nervously at their surroundings. The camp loomed beyond the platform, its barbed wire fences glittering under the midday sun, watchtowers casting long shadows across the earth. Among the newcomers, one figure caught Harris's attention, Wilhelm Kruger. His posture was upright, though not rigid, his eyes calm and observant. When Harris called his name, Wilhelm answered in clear English. "Yes, Captain. Wilhelm Kruger, civilian teacher, drafted in 42. The clarity of his voice startled Harris. "You speak English well." Wilhelm gave a slight nod. "I taught it to my students in Hamburg. Now it serves me in less expected circumstances." There was no arrogance in his tone, only a quiet acceptance of fate. Harris marked his name and moved on, but something lingered, an impression that this man saw the world differently from those around him. The prisoners were led through the camp gates. Dust rose under their boots, and the scent of dry earth mixed with the faint aroma of food drifting from the mess hall. Some looked astonished when they glimpsed rows of barracks, orderly if modest, and beyond them fields stretching toward the horizon. "They treat us like soldiers, not animals," one whispered in German. Another muttered, "It will not last." "Wait until they show their true face." Harris overheard fragments of these exchanges through interpreters. He knew suspicion would not vanish in a day, nor trust bloom overnight. Yet he also saw eyes soften when guards offered canteens of water and backs straighten with a flicker of dignity, when addressed not as beasts but as men. Later that evening, Harris walked past the barracks as the prisoners settled in. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet. From within the wooden huts came the sound of muffled conversation, weary laughter, and even a faint tune hummed by someone trying to hold on to fragments of home. Outside one barrack, Harris paused as Wilhelm approached, hands behind his back. "Captain Harris," he said politely, "may I ask a question?" Harris eyed him warily. "As long as it isn't about escaping." A shadow of a smile crossed Wilhelm's face. "No, nothing like that. I wondered, are we permitted to write letters to our families?" Harris hesitated. "Yes, they'll be censored, but you may write. Mail will take time." "Time," Wilhelm repeated softly. "We have plenty of that now." His eyes lifted toward the darkening horizon, and for a moment Harris sensed not an enemy officer, but a weary teacher, a man pulled from classrooms into battlefields he never sought. The first night in camp was quiet. Guards patrolled with measured steps, watchtowers gleamed under searchlights, and beyond the fences cicadas filled the Texas night with their relentless hum. Inside the barracks, men lay on thin cots, some drifting into uneasy dreams, others staring at the ceiling, haunted by memories of deserts, oceans, and battles far behind them. Harris, in his office, closed his logbook and sat in silence. The arrival of these prisoners was only the beginning. He sensed the challenge would not be keeping them behind fences, but facing the truths they carried with them, and the unexpected reflections they would awaken within him. The war was far away, yet its weight pressed heavy here too in the stillness of a Texas night. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, though nothing about it felt ordinary. At dawn, the clang of the camp bell stirred the prisoners from their cots. They lined up for roll call, their boots raising dust clouds that clung to the air. Breakfast was simple. Powdered eggs, bread and coffee for the guards, ersatz substitutes for the prisoners, but it was food, and no one left hungry. To men who had marched half-starved across deserts, it felt like abundance. Captain Harris observed this routine carefully. Regulations demanded vigilance, yet his eyes often wandered past the rows of uniforms and into the details of daily life. He noticed how quickly the men claimed small corners of the camp as their own. A soccer pitch emerged in a patch of open ground. Strips of fabric became makeshift nets. Whenever the ball, stitched together from rags and scraps, rolled across the dirt, laughter rose, bright and unexpected. It struck Harris how ordinary it looked. Men chasing after a ball, shouting in German, waving their arms with boyish excitement. For a moment it was as though war had vanished. Guards leaned against the fence, half amused, half bewildered. Harris kept his composure, though a strange unease tugged at him. Was it dangerous to let enemies taste joy here? Or was it the very thing that revealed their shared humanity? In the evenings the camp filled with sound. Someone brought out a violin, strings worn but still capable of melody. Others joined with harmonicas, and before long a choir of voices lifted into the warm Texas night. Songs of home, some mournful, others spirited, echoed beyond the barbed wire. Harris, listening from his office, found the music haunting. It carried a longing that words could not capture, and he wondered if the guards felt it too. One evening Wilhelm approached him as the choir sang. "Captain Harris," he said in English, his tone soft but deliberate, "may I ask you something?" Harris folded his arms. "Go ahead." "Why is it," Wilhelm asked, nodding toward the music, "that we are allowed this? We were told Americans would treat us like animals. Yet here you allow us to sing, to play, even to smile." Harris considered his answer. "Because you're still men." "Prisoners, yes, but men all the same, and men need something to hold on to." Wilhelm studied him for a moment, then replied quietly, "Perhaps this is why your country feels different. Even in defeat, you give us dignity." The words unsettled Harris. He was trained to enforce rules, not to inspire admiration from the enemy. Yet here was a man, once a soldier of an opposing army, acknowledging something Harris himself barely understood. Beyond the fences, the local community wrestled with conflicting emotions. Farmers appreciated the prisoners' labor when they were sent out under guard to work in the fields, yet whispers of resentment spread through town. "Why should they eat better than our own boys overseas?" one shopkeeper muttered. "They're the enemy. They don't deserve comfort." Harris heard these complaints often. Each time he felt the weight of contradiction pressing on him. He could not deny the truth. Inside the fences, some prisoners were beginning to admire America, not out of coercion but from simple exposure to kindness and order. Yet outside the camp, Americans who had lost brothers and sons to the war bristled at the idea of compassion. The tension was never spoken aloud within the barracks, but Harris sensed it building. He saw it in the way prisoners carried themselves, no longer braced for humiliation, but cautiously hopeful as if they had discovered something unexpected on American soil. And he saw it in his own men, who found themselves listening to German songs with reluctant appreciation, even if they would never admit it openly. Night after night, Harris walked the camp's perimeter. The air smelled of dry grass and pine carried on the wind. In the distance, coyotes howled, their cries blending with the murmur of human voices from the barracks. Harris paused, listening, caught between duty and something harder to define. These men were enemies, yet he felt himself drawn closer to their humanity, as though the fences were less about keeping them in and more about keeping the world's hard truths out. It was only the beginning, but Harris already sensed the battle inside this camp would not be fought with weapons. It would be fought within hearts, his own most of all. Letters arrived in bundles carried across oceans and borders before finding their way into the camp office. For Captain Harris, the familiar handwriting of Margaret, his fiancée, always stirred a mixture of comfort and unease. He unfolded the paper carefully, smelling faint traces of lavender soap, a fragrance she often used. Her words were steady, patriotic, even stern. "Robert," she wrote, "do not forget what these men represent. Our brothers and fathers are fighting overseas while you guard those who once aimed rifles at them. Do not let pity cloud your duty. They are the enemy, never forget that." Harris read the words twice, his jaw tightening. Margaret's letters always spoke of ration lines, of neighbours sacrificing sugar and gasoline, of women working long hours in factories. The war was everywhere at home, demanding resilience from those left behind. Yet when Harris looked out through his office window, he saw German prisoners laughing during a soccer match, their bodies lean but strong, their faces open with expressions of relief. The contrast gnawed at him. His countrymen suffered shortages, while these captives, though confined, seemed spared the harshest blows of war. One evening he crossed paths with Sergeant Miller, a grizzled guard who had little patience for subtlety. "Sir," Miller muttered, watching a group of prisoners walk back from work detail, "sometimes I wonder why we feed them better than our own boys. My cousin writes me from Italy. He's living on cold beans and fear while these men sing songs at night. Doesn't sit right." Harris didn't answer immediately. He knew the argument well. He had heard it in town, in Margaret's letters, and now from his own men. Finally he replied, "The army chose to treat them this way. Discipline doesn't mean cruelty. If we abandon our principles, then what exactly are we fighting for?" Miller shook his head but said no more. The silence between them lingered like a question left unanswered. Among the prisoners, a different kind of conflict brewed. Some wrestled with guilt at their relative safety. One young soldier named Dieter confided to Wilhelm during an evening walk. "My brother is still in Russia," Dieter whispered. "He writes of frozen fields, no bread, no shelter. And here I am, eating, working, even smiling. I feel like a traitor." Wilhelm placed a hand on his shoulder. "Survival is not betrayal. Perhaps it is a chance to see another way of living. We cannot choose where fate carries us, but we can choose what we learn from it." Yet not all agreed. In the corner of the barracks, men loyal to the Nazi cause muttered bitterly. They warned others not to be softened by American kindness. "Do not forget who you are," one hissed. "This is enemy trickery. They want to break us." The camp was no longer only a place of confinement. It was a crossroads of ideas, loyalties colliding in whispers and arguments. Harris sensed it, though he could not yet see its full shape. He watched Wilhelm, who seemed caught between two worlds, respected among prisoners for his calm wisdom, but increasingly seen by guards as someone who might be dangerous in subtler ways, not through escape but through influence. As the weeks passed, the letters from home grew heavier in tone. Margaret reminded Harris of her brother, drafted and waiting to be shipped overseas. "He risks his life for freedom," she wrote, "while you look after men who once cheered tyranny. Do not grow soft, Robert. We cannot afford softness now." Harris folded the letter and stared into the night, listening to the faint strains of a German lullaby drifting from the barracks. He thought of Margaret's words, of Miller's resentment, of prisoners torn between guilt and gratitude. The war raged thousands of miles away, yet its shadows reached across the Atlantic, settling heavily on the dusty soil of Texas. Within the fences, life seemed deceptively calm, but Harris knew the storm of conflict, ideological, emotional, and deeply personal, was only just beginning to break. The first notes rose tentatively, carried on the cool evening air. A handful of German prisoners gathered in the yard, their voices weaving into a fragile harmony. Soon the choir grew, stronger and fuller, as men who had once marched to military drums now lifted songs of home. Their tones blended with the chirping of crickets and the faint rustle of wind through the pines, until the camp was wrapped in music that felt far removed from war. Captain Harris stood at the edge of the yard, arms crossed. He told himself he was there to ensure order, yet he could not deny the quiet pull in his chest. The choir's song was haunting, filled with longing, with something that reached beyond uniforms and ranks. A few guards had paused to listen as well, their rifles slung casually, expressions softened in spite of themselves. Wilhelm directed the group, raising his hand to guide the tempo. When the final chord faded, a hush settled over the camp. Then, almost unexpectedly, a ripple of applause broke from the guards. It was not official, not military, but human. Later that night, as Harris walked back toward his office, Lieutenant Dawson, his immediate superior, intercepted him. Dawson's jaw was tight, his voice clipped. "What in God's name was that, Harris? A concert?" "They were singing," Harris replied evenly. I don't care what you call it, Dawson snapped. This is a prisoner of war camp, not a social club. You think Command wants to hear that their officers are letting Germans serenade them? They weren't serenading anyone, Harris said. They were holding on to what's left of themselves. Dawson narrowed his eyes. You're getting soft. Remember who they are. Every one of those men would have pulled a trigger on you without hesitation if they'd had the chance. The words stung, but Harris held his ground. Maybe, but they didn't, and now they're here. My job is to keep order. If a song keeps them from despair or rebellion, then I'd call it effective. Dawson shook his head. Effective? You're blinded. Discipline is what keeps order, not sympathy. Watch yourself, Harris. I'll be reporting this. Harris returned to his office with the reprimand ringing in his ears. He knew Dawson wasn't entirely wrong. Regulations demanded a firm hand. Yet what Dawson saw as weakness, Harris increasingly recognized as strength. The prisoners responded not to fear but to respect. The following day, Harris found Wilhelm repairing a broken bench near the mess hall. The German paused and wiped sweat from his brow as Harris approached. Your choir was impressive, Harris said. Wilhelm smiled faintly. It was nothing more than voices trying not to forget who they once were. Harris hesitated before adding, It's causing problems for me. My superior thinks I'm letting the camp turn into a festival. Wilhelm's expression grew serious. I'm sorry if it makes trouble, but Captain, you must understand, many of these men have lost everything. Songs are all they can carry from home. Without them, they are just uniforms with empty hearts. The words lingered in Harris's mind long after Wilhelm returned to his work. He knew the camp could not become a place of indulgence, but he also sensed that denying humanity would only breed bitterness. The balance was fragile, and he walked it every day. That evening, the choir sang again, softer this time, careful not to draw too much attention. Harris listened from a distance, his thoughts heavy. Dawson's warning weighed on him, yet so did Wilhelm's truth. Between the fences and the towers, bonds were forming, bonds fragile as glass yet undeniable. And with each passing day, Harris felt the line between prisoner and guard blur just slightly, forcing him to question where true strength lay, in barriers of wire and rule or in the courage to see the enemy as human. The morning sun rose over endless rows of cotton, its golden light shimmering across the fields outside the camp. A convoy of trucks rattled down the dirt road, carrying German prisoners to work detail. The men sat quietly in the back, their eyes scanning the vast Texas landscape. Some whispered among themselves, others simply stared, lost in thoughts of home. Captain Harris rode in the lead truck, his cap pulled low against the glare. The assignment was simple: oversee prisoners assisting local farmers with the harvest. Labor was scarce. Too many American men were overseas fighting, and women and older men alone could not manage the acres of fields demanding attention. The war had created strange alliances, and here in the heart of Texas, enemy soldiers bent their backs to American soil. When the trucks halted at the edge of the farm, the prisoners filed out under the watchful eyes of guards. Farmer Charles Whitaker greeted Harris with a skeptical glance. His weathered face, shaded by a wide-brimmed hat, carried years of toil and suspicion. "You're sure about this, Captain?" he asked. "I've got neighbors who don't take kindly to the idea of Huns working our land." "They're here to help, Mr. Whitaker," Harris answered. "They'll be supervised. No one's escaping. You'll get your harvest." Whitaker grunted, clearly unconvinced, but pointed toward the fields. "Cotton won't pick itself." The prisoners spread out, each handed a sack. They bent to the work, fingers tugging cotton from prickly bolls under the unforgiving sun. At first their movements were awkward, uncertain. Then rhythm took over, hands pulling, sacks filling, sweat dripping down their brows. Wilhelm moved steadily among them, his face calm, his voice steady as he encouraged younger men who faltered. Hours passed. The guards kept their rifles ready, but no one showed signs of mischief. Instead, something unexpected began to unfold. Whitaker's wife, a stout woman with kind eyes, brought out pitchers of water. At first, she set them down without a word. Yet, as she watched the men drink, she murmured almost to herself, "They're just boys." Harris caught her words. He saw her watching the prisoners as they wiped dust from their faces, their expressions weary but grateful. The image unsettled him. Only weeks ago these men had worn enemy uniforms. Now they looked like any laborers, indistinguishable from farmhands who might have lived down the road. Later, during a short break, Harris walked past Wilhelm, who had set down his sack. "Not so different from farm work back home?" Harris asked. Wilhelm smiled faintly. "In Hamburg my hands held chalk, not cotton. But labor is labor. It reminds a man he is still useful." "You don't resent it?" Harris pressed. Wilhelm shook his head. "Resentment is wasted energy. Besides, we work, we eat. That is more than many have now." His gaze drifted toward the horizon, thoughtful. "And it shows us something. How your people live, what they value. It is not what we were told." The words stayed with Harris as the day wore on. He noticed how prisoners and farmers, though separated by uniforms and rifles, began to acknowledge one another with cautious nods. One farmer's son, barely 12, watched wide-eyed as a German prisoner hefted a heavy sack and carried it with ease. The boy whispered to his mother, "He's strong," and she hushed him quickly, glancing toward Harris. By evening, when the trucks prepared to return to camp, Whitaker approached again. His tone was less sharp than before. "They worked hard," he admitted. "Didn't expect that." He hesitated before adding, "Suppose I owe you thanks." Harris gave a small nod. "Just doing our duty." As the trucks rumbled back toward the camp, dust swirling behind them, Harris studied the faces of the men riding in the back. They were tired, yes, but not defeated. Something had shifted in the fields, an invisible thread of recognition, fragile but real, between enemies who shared the same sun and soil. It was a small moment, but Harris knew such moments carried weight. Perhaps more than rifles or orders ever could. The barracks at night carried two different kinds of silence. One was the heavy quiet of men surrendering to exhaustion, drifting into uneasy sleep. The other was sharper, secretive, a silence that concealed whispered voices plotting in corners. Captain Harris sensed both as he made his evening rounds, his boots crunching softly against gravel. The camp looked calm, but tension coiled beneath the surface. Within the barracks, certain prisoners gathered after lights out, their conversations hushed yet charged. Among them was Ernst Vogel, a broad-shouldered sergeant with piercing eyes. Vogel carried himself with the rigid authority of a man unwilling to let defeat loosen his grip on ideology. His words, though whispered, carried venom. "They want us to sing their songs, eat their food, bow to their generosity," Vogel hissed to a small circle of loyalists. "Do not be fooled. This is not kindness. It is poison meant to make us forget who we are." One younger prisoner shifted uncomfortably. "But they treat us better than our own officers ever did. We have food, work, even music." Vogel's glare cut through him. "That is the trick. They want to break our spirit without a bullet. Anyone who praises this place betrays his homeland." Not far from that circle, Wilhelm lay awake on his cot, listening. He did not need to hear every word to understand the meaning. He knew men like Vogel, men who clung to ideology like a lifeline even when the world beneath them crumbled. Wilhelm felt the weight of their hostility, though he had never spoken against them directly. Still, his calm demeanor, his willingness to converse with guards, his visible respect for Harris, made him a quiet target. The next morning, Harris noticed Wilhelm's distracted expression as the prisoners assembled for roll call. After the formation dismissed, he approached him. "So you look troubled," Harris remarked. Wilhelm hesitated before replying. "Some men, they cannot let go. They believe every gesture here is a trap. They want to silence anyone who thinks otherwise." "Are you in danger?" Harris pressed. Wilhelm shook his head lightly. "Not yet." But whispers spread faster than truth. "Captain, I will not deny what I see. Your country, it has shown us fairness, even dignity. Some of us are grateful. That alone is enough to make enemies inside these fences." Harris studied him carefully. The words struck close to his own conflicted heart. He had wrestled with doubts about fairness and loyalty, but hearing a prisoner speak so plainly unsettled him. "If they threaten you," Harris said firmly, "you come to me." Wilhelm gave a faint smile. "And if I do, they will say I am collaborating. Sometimes silence is safer than honesty." The conversation lingered with Harris all day. He knew Vogel by reputation, unyielding, bitter, a man who refused to accept defeat. The army manual advised handling such prisoners with strict discipline, yet Harris wondered if force would only feed their fire. That evening, while inspecting the yard, he overheard 2 guards discussing the matter. "Those Krauts, some of them are warming up to this place," one said. "But a few, they're different. Eyes hard as stone." "Yeah," the other replied. "If you ask me, they're more dangerous now than with rifles. Can't fight us in the field, so they fight us in mines." Harris kept walking, but their words echoed his own thoughts. The danger was not escape or rebellion with weapons. It was the battle for allegiance fought in whispers, in loyalty tests, in silent stares exchanged across bunks. Later, as the camp quieted, Wilhelm sat near the fence, staring into the dark. A guard nearby asked him casually, "Thinking about home?" Wilhelm replied softly, "Yes, but also about here. Sometimes I am not sure which place feels more real." His honesty startled the guard, who said nothing further. Harris, watching from a distance, felt a chill. The cracks inside the camp were widening, not just between captors and captives, but among the prisoners themselves. And cracks, Harris knew, had a way of spreading until walls gave way. The news reached Harris in a plain brown envelope, stamped with the insignia of the War Department. He opened it slowly, the weight of official letters always pressing on his chest. His eyes scanned the lines, and the words blurred as he read them once, then again. His younger brother, Thomas, had been killed in action in France. For a long time, Harris sat at his desk, unable to move. He thought of Thomas's boyish grin, the way he had always insisted on racing him across the fields back home. The letters filled with optimism he had sent before shipping overseas. Now there would be no more letters, only silence. That night, Margaret's latest note lay unopened on his desk. When at last he read it, her words carried no knowledge of Thomas's death. She spoke instead of her fears, her prayers, and her warning not to let compassion soften his duty. Harris folded the letter without finishing, bitterness tightening in his chest. The following morning, he walked the camp with an expression so rigid even the guards noticed. Prisoners lined up as usual, their voices subdued under the weight of the Texan sun. Harris's eyes drifted toward Wilhelm, who seemed to study him with quiet understanding. Later, Wilhelm approached cautiously as Harris stood alone near the fence. "Captain," he said softly, "you look as though you've received heavy news." Harris hesitated. He was not in the habit of sharing personal matters with prisoners, yet the weight inside him pressed too hard for silence. "My brother," he said at last, "killed in France." Wilhelm's face grew solemn. He lowered his gaze, then lifted it again with quiet steadiness. "I am sorry. Truly. Words cannot fill such a loss, but I have felt something similar. Hamburg has been bombed again. My mother and sister, they did not survive." The 2 men stood in silence, the distance between guard and prisoner momentarily erased by grief. Harris felt an unexpected kinship, a recognition that pain knew no borders. Wilhelm spoke again, his voice low. "War takes everything. Home, family, even the idea of who we are. Sometimes the only thing left is the hope that when it ends we might rebuild something human." Harris clenched his jaw. "It's easier to say than to believe." "Perhaps," Wilhelm admitted. "But what else is there? To live only with anger? That is another prison, Captain, one without fences." The words sank into Harris like stones. He thought of Margaret's insistence on hardness, of Dawson's warnings, of the resentment simmering in town. And yet, here was Wilhelm, a man in enemy uniform, speaking not with arrogance, but with the weary wisdom of shared loss. That evening, Harris walked the perimeter longer than usual. The Texas sky was painted with streaks of red and gold as the sun sank. In the barracks, men spoke in low tones, their voices carrying fragments of distant memories. A young prisoner described his father's bakery in Bremen, the smell of bread in the mornings. Another recalled the sound of church bells in his village. Harris listened without meaning to, each story echoing pieces of his own past life, summers on the farm, evenings when his mother hummed hymns by the fire. It struck him with painful clarity. The fences separated geography but not memory. Every man here carried echoes of home, fractured yet alive. When Harris finally returned to his office, he picked up Margaret's letter again. He read her closing line. "Stay strong, Robert. Do not forget what side you are on." He placed it back on the desk, his chest heavy. He knew his side. Yet the boundaries of enemy and friend were no longer simple. Grief had carved out a hollow inside him, and in that hollow he recognized the truth. Pain had made strangers of them all, yet it also bound them together in ways no order could undo. The rhythm of camp life carried on, yet beneath it a quiet transformation stirred. Harris sensed it first in the small gestures, prisoners greeting guards with nods instead of wary stares, or farmers lingering longer to exchange a few words with men who worked their fields. The lines between enemy and neighbor were blurring, even if the barbed wire still stood sharp and unyielding. One afternoon, Harris accompanied a group of prisoners back from a day of farm labor. Dust clung to their clothes, sweat streaked their brows, but there was a lightness in their steps. As they unloaded tools, Farmer Whitaker's wife appeared, clutching a basket of biscuits wrapped in cloth. She hesitated, then offered it to the group. "You saved our harvest," she said quietly. "We would have lost most of it without your help." The prisoners froze, unsure how to respond. Then Wilhelm stepped forward, bowing his head slightly. "Danke," he said, then corrected himself. "Thank you. We are glad to have helped." Harris watched the exchange, his chest tightening. Weeks ago, these men had been symbols of hatred. Now they were recipients of gratitude from an American family. It was a small crack in the wall of enmity, yet profound. Back in the barracks, however, cracks widened in another way. Ernst Vogel and his loyalists whispered fiercely, their words dripping with contempt. "Look at them," Vogel sneered, "smiling at Americans as if they are friends, weaklings. They forget who they are." Dieter, the young soldier, shifted uneasily. "But the work, it shows us a different side. They are not monsters." "Maybe we were wrong to believe," Vogel cut him off, voice sharp as steel. "Wrong? Do you want to crawl like a dog at their feet? We are Germans. Do not forget it, or you will answer for it." The tension was palpable. Harris knew something was festering, though he could not yet name its shape. He saw Wilhelm trying to keep peace, offering words of reassurance to men like Dieter, who felt torn between old loyalties and new impressions. But Harris also noticed the way Wilhelm's presence drew suspicion from Vogel's group, as if his calm acceptance of American fairness was the greatest betrayal of all. At the officers' quarters, the army's stance grew harsher. Orders arrived from command, warning of excessive fraternization. Harris read the directive aloud in the mess hall. "Discipline must remain firm. Guard against enemy sympathies. The camp is not to become a place of comfort or attachment." Lieutenant Dawson smirked as Harris folded the paper. "See, headquarters knows what I've been telling you. You let them grow too fond of this place and you'll regret it." Harris replied quietly, "Or maybe we'll regret teaching them only bitterness. You think hate will make them less dangerous when they return home?" Dawson scoffed. "That's not our problem. Our duty is to keep them contained, nothing more." But Harris knew it was more. He could see it in Wilhelm's eyes, in the way Dieter hesitated before joining Vogel's circle, in the gratitude of a farmer's wife who had once feared even the sight of these men. The war outside the fences was still raging, but inside, another battle was unfolding, one for the loyalties and hearts of men who had seen both cruelty and unexpected mercy. That night, Harris lingered near the fence line. From the barracks came muffled voices, some rising in laughter, others in argument. The cicadas sang their endless refrain, the stars spread wide above the Texas sky. He wondered how many prisoners now dreaded the thought of returning to Germany, how many silently prayed for the impossible, to stay in the land of their captors. The question weighed on him heavily, for Harris knew the day would come when orders would decide their fate. And when that day arrived, no regulation could erase the truth that something irreversible had already taken root inside these fences. The spring of 1945 arrived with a strange tension in the air. Rumors drifted into the camp like dust on the wind. Germany was faltering, cities lay in ruins, and surrender no longer sounded like fantasy, but inevitability. The prisoners sensed it before any officer confirmed it. Their conversations grew sharper, their silences longer. Every newspaper, every whispered report from guards seemed to carry the weight of approaching collapse. Harris noticed the change. When he walked the yard, he saw men huddled in tight groups arguing in low voices. Some faces brightened at the thought that the war might finally end. Others darkened with dread, fearing what awaited them in a homeland shattered by bombs. One afternoon, Harris found Wilhelm sitting alone near the fence, a book balanced on his knees. The man looked up, eyes clouded with thoughts far away. "You've heard," Harris said quietly. Wilhelm nodded. "It is everywhere now. Berlin under siege, Hamburg gone, families scattered. If surrender comes—" He trailed off, then added, "Many here fear returning more than they feared capture." Harris frowned. "You mean they'd rather stay?" "Yes," Wilhelm said simply. "Here they work, they eat, they live without constant terror. There, what is left? Rubble, ashes, bitterness, perhaps graves." The honesty in his tone unsettled Harris. He thought of the farmers who now relied on prisoner labor, of the guards who grudgingly respected these men, of the fragile bonds formed inside the wire. Could it be possible that prisoners wished captivity to last? That evening, Harris overheard conversations as he passed the barracks. Dieter whispered to another young soldier, "If they send us back, what will we find? My family may be gone. At least here I have work, food, even peace." The other replied bitterly, "Peace? Behind fences? Don't be a fool. A German belongs in Germany." But Dieter's eyes told another story, one Harris had seen in many faces. The thought of going back to ruins was more frightening than confinement. In contrast, Vogel's voice grew louder, more defiant. He preached of loyalty, of duty to the fatherland, insisting that surrender was temporary and honor eternal. Yet fewer men gathered around him now. His words rang hollow against the gnawing truth of defeat. Inside the officers' quarters, Harris received new directives. Command anticipated surrender, and camps were to prepare for eventual repatriation. The thought settled on him like a stone. He imagined the day trains would arrive to carry the prisoners eastward, away from the Texas soil they had unexpectedly grown to love. Lieutenant Dawson, ever sharp-edged, seemed almost gleeful. "About time. We've coddled them long enough. Let them go back and see what their war has brought them." Harris did not reply. Instead, he thought of Wilhelm's quiet despair, of Dieter's trembling uncertainty, of the gratitude in farmers' eyes when their harvests were saved. He thought of his own brother, buried in a foreign land, and wondered whether vengeance or compassion carried more meaning in the end. As April unfolded, the prisoners grew restless. At night, their songs carried a different tone, no longer just nostalgia, but sorrow laced with fear. Guards heard men crying quietly into their pillows, muffling grief they could no longer contain. Harris, making his rounds, paused often to listen, the sounds piercing him more deeply than any gunfire. One evening, Wilhelm approached him again. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed unease. "Captain, when the orders come, I will go, we all will. But know this, many hearts will stay here, even if bodies must leave." Harris met his gaze, unable to answer. For the first time, he understood the impossible paradox. The camp, built to contain enemies, had become a place some considered safer than freedom. And as news of surrender drew closer, Harris realized the hardest part was yet to come, not keeping prisoners behind fences, but letting them go when they no longer wanted to leave. The telegram arrived just after dawn, carried in the hand of a courier who left as quickly as he had come. Harris stood in his office, with the paper trembling slightly between his fingers. The message was short, blunt, and without sentiment. "Prepare prisoners for immediate repatriation. Transport scheduled within the week." For a long moment, Harris stared at the words. They seemed unreal, yet the weight of them pressed like iron. This was what he had known would come, but knowing did little to soften the blow. He imagined the camp without the daily chorus of voices, without the sight of men bent over fields, without the strange rhythm that had become as much a part of him as his own breath. When the announcement was made in the yard, silence fell heavier than any storm. The prisoners stood rigid, their faces blank at first as if the meaning had not yet sunk in. Then the murmurs began, uncertain, desperate, disbelieving. Some men lowered their heads, shoulders shaking. Others cried out in protest, their voices breaking against the fences. "No, we cannot go back," one shouted. A guard stepped forward sharply, but Harris raised a hand. He understood. The outcry was not rebellion, but grief. Among the men, Wilhelm's face was pale, his lips pressed tight. When Harris's eyes found his, Wilhelm spoke with a calmness that carried far more weight than the cries around him. "Captain," he said, his voice trembling only at the edges, "you do not understand. Many of us, we have nothing left in Germany. No homes, no families, no future. Here at least we found dignity again." The words pierced the air, silencing even Vogel, who stood scowling nearby. Harris felt the eyes of his guards upon him, waiting to see how he would respond. Yet no regulation in any manual could prepare him for this moment. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I cannot change the orders," Harris said at last. "The war is ending. The army has decided. You will be sent back." The disappointment that rippled through the men was almost unbearable. Grown soldiers, hardened by battle, wept openly. Some clutched at the fences, as if they could anchor themselves to this soil by sheer will. Harris, watching, felt a hollow ache. He thought of his brother's grave in France, of Margaret's words urging him to stay strong, of the farmers who had quietly admitted they would miss the help in their fields. Nothing about this departure felt like victory. That evening, Harris found Wilhelm sitting on the steps of the barracks, his hands clasped tightly together. "You told them the truth," Wilhelm said without looking up. "You cannot change the orders. I know this. But still, I wish you could have seen their faces. They wanted to stay." "I did see," Harris replied quietly. Wilhelm lifted his gaze. "Then you understand. We came here as enemies, but many of us leave with hearts changed. That is not weakness, it is revelation." Harris had no answer. He only nodded, the weight of duty pressing harder with every breath. The camp settled into a strange stillness in the following days. Prisoners packed their meager belongings in silence. Some carved small gifts from wood, leaving tokens behind for guards they had come to respect. Others wrote letters they knew might never reach their destinations. The air was thick with sorrow, heavier than any barbed wire. Harris walked the grounds each evening, listening to the faint murmur of voices, the occasional sob muffled by walls. He tried to imagine the camp empty, its silence stretching endlessly. The thought filled him with unease he could not explain. The orders had been given. Soon trains would come, and the camp that had bound enemies and captors together in uneasy humanity would dissolve into memory. Harris knew the hardest part was still ahead, saying goodbye to men who no longer wished to leave. The camp carried a new stillness in its final days, as though every sound and gesture was absorbed into a quiet farewell. The prisoners went about their routines with unusual calm, not from acceptance, but from the heaviness of inevitability. Each morning they rose at the bell, yet instead of the usual chatter, silence clung to them like a second uniform. Harris walked among them, feeling the weight of their stares. He saw men carving figures from scraps of wood, fashioning trinkets to leave behind, some whittled animals, others crosses, a few small boxes with intricate patterns etched into the grain. These were not idle creations, but offerings, tokens of gratitude to guards or farmers, or even Harris himself. Each one was a reminder that the camp, for all its fences, had been more than a prison. One afternoon, Wilhelm approached Harris with something wrapped in cloth. He held it out with both hands, his face solemn. "For you, Captain," Wilhelm said. Harris unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a hand-carved eagle, wings outstretched, every line precise. The wood was smooth, polished by hours of care. "It is not a symbol of conquest," Wilhelm explained. "It is a symbol of freedom, the kind that rises above borders. Keep it, so you will remember that even in war, we found dignity here." Harris swallowed hard. "I'll remember, Wilhelm." In the evenings, the camp filled with writing. Prisoners hunched over tables, scratching letters by candlelight. Some wrote to families they hoped were still alive. though they feared their words would never find their way across the ruins of Germany. Others wrote to the Americans they had worked for, leaving behind notes of thanks. The air was thick with the sound of pens and the unspoken ache of final words. The local community, too, felt the shift. Farmers who had once eyed the prisoners with suspicion now stood by their fences to watch them return from work details. A few even waved, reluctant to say aloud what their gestures betrayed, that they would miss the men who had saved their harvests. One farmer quietly told Harris, "Never thought I'd say this, Captain, but it'll feel strange without them." The guards, hardened by duty, showed cracks as well. A sergeant who had never smiled at a prisoner before accepted a small carved pipe from one man, his voice gruff as he muttered, "Thank you." Another guard, usually stern, shook hands quickly with a prisoner before turning away to hide the emotion in his eyes. Harris noticed it all. He felt it in himself, too, the ache of impending emptiness. The camp that had been his burden had become a place of unexpected humanity. Soon it would be nothing but empty barracks and echoes of voices carried away by trains. On the last night before departure, the prisoners gathered once more in the yard. No one commanded them to sing, yet they lifted their voices together, not in martial songs but in hymns and folk tunes, melodies of longing and loss. Their voices rose into the night sky, carrying sorrow, hope, and a plea for remembrance. Guards stood listening in silence, their rifles lowered, their expressions unreadable. As the final notes faded, Wilhelm approached Harris quietly. "Captain, when we leave tomorrow, I cannot promise what the world will make of us," he. "But know this, we will remember America not as our jailer, but as the place where we were reminded of our humanity." Harris could only nod, words lost in his throat. He clutched the carved eagle tighter, its wings spread wide, as though it might lift the weight pressing on his chest. The final day loomed. The camp, once alive with work and song, now braced itself for parting. Harris knew the next sunrise would not be like the others. It would carry them all toward an ending none of them truly wanted. The dawn of departure came heavy with silence. A pale mist clung to the camp, softening the outlines of barbed wire and watchtowers, as if even the land itself wished to hide what was about to happen. Harris stood near the gates, clipboard in hand, though his grip on it was unsteady. This was procedure, nothing more. Names to be checked, men to be counted, orders to be followed. Yet no part of it felt routine. The prisoners emerged from the barracks carrying small bundles, the sum of their months in captivity reduced to sacks and pockets. Some clutched carved trinkets, others folded letters, a few photographs worn thin from too much handling. Their steps were slow, not from defiance but from sorrow. The yard, once alive with voices, was subdued into a hush, broken only by the scrape of boots on gravel. Wilhelm walked near the front of the line, his head high, though his eyes betrayed the weight in his chest. When his gaze met Harris's, he offered a faint smile that carried more pain than comfort. The roll call began. Harris read the names, each answered by a weary voice. As the list dwindled, his throat tightened. He remembered the first time he had called these names, when the men had stood stiff, braced for cruelty. Now their responses were softer, their tones carrying not fear but resignation. When the last name was marked, Harris cleared his throat. His voice, meant to be formal, wavered as he spoke. "You have conducted yourselves with discipline. Today, you return to your homeland. Whatever waits for you there, I hope you carry more than bitterness from your time here." The words echoed across the yard, and to his surprise some prisoners nodded, others murmured quiet thanks. A few even raised their hands in a small salute, not military but human. As the trucks pulled into the yard, the finality settled. Men climbed aboard slowly, many turning to look back at the barracks as though trying to memorize every plank of wood, every patch of earth. Some wept openly, tears running unchecked down faces that once had been stern with pride. One guard muttered under his breath, shaken by the sight, "Never thought I'd see Germans cry to leave." Harris remained at the gate, watching each man pass. When Wilhelm reached him, he paused. For a heartbeat, the two men stood face to face, the air thick with words unsaid. "Captain," Wilhelm whispered just loud enough for Harris to hear, "America changed us. Do not forget that. Before Harris could respond, Wilhelm stepped onto the truck, gripping the rail with steady hands. Engines roared to life, the noise breaking the fragile quiet. As the convoy rolled forward, prisoners pressed their faces to the slats, eyes lingering on the camp that had been their cage and, paradoxically, their refuge. Harris stood rooted as the vehicles rumbled down the dirt road, dust rising in their wake. The guards dispersed slowly, their usual gruffness replaced by unease. Sergeant Miller approached Harris, his brow furrowed. "Sir, I never thought I'd feel sorry for them, but watching them leave, it's like sending men into a storm." Harris nodded, unable to find words. His eyes followed the distant line of trucks until they vanished beyond the horizon. Only then did he lower his clipboard, realizing his knuckles had turned white around its edges. The camp was quiet again, emptier than he had ever known it. The barracks stood like hollow shells, their silence oppressive. Harris walked the yard alone, the echo of footsteps stark in the emptiness. The departure was over, yet its weight remained. The fences had not only confined the prisoners, they had contained something fragile and fleeting, a shared humanity that slipped through Harris's fingers as the dust of the convoy settled. And though the camp still stood, Harris knew it would never feel the same again. The camp felt deserted now, its silence unnatural. Harris walked the empty yard, the gravel crunching under his boots the only sound that broke the stillness. Where once there had been songs, laughter, arguments, even the noise of a ball bouncing against dirt, there was nothing but wind brushing against barbed wire. The absence struck him harder than he had expected. That night he sat at his desk with pen in hand, a sheet of paper before him. Margaret's letters lay stacked to the side, their stern warnings and patriotism now blending into a single distant voice. He dipped his pen into ink and began to write, not to command, not to report, but to confess. "Margaret, the prisoners are gone. The camp is empty, and yet I feel more restless than ever. I have seen men who arrived full of suspicion leave in tears. I have seen enemies carve gifts for their guards, and farmers who once cursed their presence now mourn their absence. Nothing about this war is simple anymore." His hand hesitated before continuing. "You always told me to stay strong, to remember they were the enemy. But strength, I have learned, is not hardness. It is seeing humanity even where we least expect it. These men were not monsters. They were fathers, brothers, sons, broken by war, yet capable of gratitude. Perhaps that is what victory truly means. Not destroying an enemy, but changing him." Harris leaned back, staring at the words. He thought of Wilhelm, his steady gaze and quiet wisdom. He thought of Dieter, torn between fear and hope. He thought of the carved eagle resting on his desk, its wings spread wide as if in defiance of fate. The next day, he shared the letter with no one, but he kept writing in a private journal. Each entry became a reflection of what the camp had revealed to him. "When my brother fell in France, I thought bitterness would carry me through, but bitterness consumes, leaving nothing but ash. I see now why Wilhelm spoke of dignity. Even as prisoners, men must hold on to it, and even as guards, we must learn to honor it." Later, walking through town, Harris overheard conversations about the departure. Some locals said good riddance, others admitted they missed the help. One farmer remarked, "Strange, Captain, I hated them at first, but they left behind gifts for my children. Wooden toys carved with care. Hard to hate a man who takes the time to do that." Harris nodded silently, his chest tightening with unspoken agreement. The war was winding toward its end, yet its lessons seemed only to grow heavier. That evening, Sergeant Miller stopped by his office. He lingered awkwardly before speaking. "Sir, I've been thinking, maybe we judged 'em too quick. Don't mean I forget what they fought for, but I reckon I saw more of their hearts here than I ever expected." Harris looked up, surprised by the sergeant's candor. "You're not alone, Miller. I think they left a mark on all of us." Miller nodded, then left, leaving Harris once more in silence. As he returned to his journal, Harris wrote one final thought for the night. War strips away illusions, but sometimes it reveals truths we would never have seen otherwise. The men who cried at leaving America taught me something my own uniform never did. That freedom is not only a nation's banner, but the dignity of every man who longs for a place to belong. The ink dried on the page as the camp around him lay still, carrying memories in its wooden walls. Harris closed the journal, feeling the weight of the silence. For the first time, he realized that the fences had never truly confined the prisoners. They had confined him, holding his view of the world within narrow lines. And now that they stood empty, he wondered if he was finally free. The camp stood empty now, its silence a constant reminder of absence. The barracks, once filled with voices, held only the faint scent of smoke from long-dead stoves and the scuffs of boots worn into the floorboards. Harris walked slowly across the grounds, his hand brushing the fence, as though the rough wire might still hum with the memory of those who had leaned against it. He paused near the gate, the same place where he had once watched prisoners file out to the trucks. The dust had long since settled, but in his mind he could still see Wilhelm turning to whisper his final words. "America changed us." That phrase lingered like an echo, impossible to silence. At his desk, the carved eagle remained, wings spread wide as if ready to lift into flight. Harris often stared at it, seeing in its shape the contradictions of war. Captives who had found a strange kind of freedom, enemies who had learned to admire their captors. He wondered what Wilhelm carried back with him to the ruins of Germany, whether he still spoke of the camp in Texas, whether he still believed dignity could be rebuilt from ashes. One evening, Harris read aloud from his journal to Margaret, who had finally come to visit. She sat stiffly as he spoke, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "They cried when they left," he told her, "not because they feared punishment, but because they had found something worth keeping here. Do you see what that means?" Margaret's eyes softened, though her voice remained guarded. "It means you grew too close, Robert. You forgot what they were." "No," he said firmly. "I remembered exactly what they were, and I saw what they became. That is the difference. War tried to strip them of humanity, but here, of all places, they found it again." Margaret fell silent, her gaze drifting to the eagle on his desk. For the first time she seemed to hesitate, as though her certainty no longer felt unshakable. Harris continued walking the camp each day until his reassignment orders came. The guards who remained shared the same unease. One confessed quietly, "Feels wrong, Captain, like we broke something by sending them back." "Or maybe," Harris replied, "we built something. Even if it can't last here, it will live in memory." As the sun set behind the towers for the last time, Harris stood alone, listening to the wind sweep across the empty yard. He imagined the choir rising once more, voices threading through the dusk, carrying their songs not to Germany, not to America, but to some place beyond war, where men were no longer divided by fences. He closed his eyes and whispered a farewell, not to soldiers, not to prisoners, but to men who had shared pieces of their humanity with him. "Goodbye," he murmured. "May you carry what you found here." The camp would soon be dismantled, its timber repurposed, its fences torn down. Yet Harris knew its legacy could not be erased. For him, it had rewritten the meaning of duty, reshaped the idea of victory. It had shown him that even in the darkest of conflicts, bonds could form strong enough to make enemies weep at parting. And so the story closed, not with triumph, not with bitterness, but with the fragile truth that hearts could change even in the heart of war. If this story moved you, remember to subscribe for more untold histories that reveal the hidden faces of the past. And before you leave, click on the video suggested on your screen now to continue this journey into the stories the world has nearly forgotten.